Today, I am here with Jeffrey Smith, who is the founder of the Institute for Responsible Technology. I am just so happy to have you here today. Thank you for taking the time to be with me.
My pleasure, Gene.
Well, you have written a movie that you wrote, you produced, you directed, with Amy Hart. I am so excited about this movie, and it shares so many powerful stories of people who've regained their health after changing to, an organic diet, free of GMOs, Roundup, other toxic-free pesticides. The movie is called Secret Ingredients. You just happen to have a poster of it behind you, so thumbs up. What started you on this project?
Well, I've been doing this for 23 years. So 23 years ago, I had no idea just how dangerous GMOs were. In fact, I went to a lecture by a scientist that hadn't yet been planted and for commercialization, but I was living in Iowa and they were about to be planted throughout my state. And the scientist was basically blowing the whistle. He was a genetic engineer, and yet he said because of what he knows about the technology, it was absolutely certain that it was unpredictable, unsafe, and that it was not ready to be introduced into our food supply because there could be allergens or toxins or new diseases or nutritional problems that could follow in the wake of the massive collateral damage that occurs as a result of the process of genetic engineering. It was not a precise, safe, and predictable technology like it was being presented by the industry and their supporters in Washington. Furthermore, he said in this lecture that once it's released into the environment, it will cross-pollinate and it will become part of the gene pool, and we have no technology to reverse that. And so we have corrupted the gene pool for soy and corn and these other GMOs forever, unless some science fiction future arrives with a new technology to clean it up. So we're not passing on the pristine natural gene pool, we're passing on a corrupted, altered gene pool. And now we see that not only are GMOs dangerous, but the Roundup they're spraying on it is dangerous, the toxins that's produced as an insecticide is dangerous. We have evidence. We can go into the details of what can go wrong in the body and what we actually are expecting to happen when people switch to a non-GMO organic diet.
Wow. Well, before we get into the movie, let's start with some basics. What are GMOs?
Genetically modified organisms. So let's call two classes of GMOs. One is you take genes from one species and you force it into the DNA of other species. Or the second is you edit. You cut out some section, you double a section, you use editing scissors inside, but you don't necessarily transfer genes into that process. So the process itself creates massive collateral damage in either case. So in the new gene editing, which again they're talking about is precise, predictable, and safe, and it's not, they declared, we have taken the genes out of a cow so it won't produce horns. So now we can stuff a lot more cows into a factory farm, and these are the future of cows because they'll be gene edited, and they actually said there was no side effects. And when they published this peer-reviewed article a couple of years ago, they even had a letter in the same journal saying, this proves we don't need any regulation or safety assessments. Gene editing is safe, predictable, the mantra. Well, just recently, the FDA decided to sequence the DNA of these cows, and lo and behold, in the process of genetic engineering, a bunch of the bacteria that they used to insert the gene ended up in the cow DNA, and they were antibiotic-resistant genes. Now that means that if it transfers to pathogens, it could create antibiotic-resistant super diseases, which linked to death and amputations. And it was a very dangerous thing. And they were already in the process of breeding these cattle out so that they would be the future. And this is just one of a long string. I mean, the stories are hair-raising about the near misses and, when we get into it, what's really happening to the health as a result of these products.
So why are GMO foods produced?
Well, the primary reason was driven by Monsanto, which has since been bought by Bayer, so we can call them about Bayer Aspirin Company. They had an herbicide called Roundup with a chief poison called glyphosate. The patent on glyphosate was running out in 2000. So they needed a way to increase sales or to maintain sales. So they created Roundup ready crops, and more than 85% of the GMOs out there are Roundup ready, engineered not to die when sprayed with Roundup herbicide. Normally Roundup will kill soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, alfalfa. These are the 6 main GMOs, all of which have become Roundup ready in large proportions of the crops in the United States. So farmers, instead of spraying specifically on weeds or using hose or spraying before the emergence of the crops, they just spray right over the crops. And then the Roundup ends up absorbing into the crops. It gets in there big time and ends up in the food, and then we eat it. And the Roundup is linked to diseases. The process of genetic engineering is linked to diseases. And there's another major trait, which is producing a toxic insecticide inside corn, cotton, and soybeans that will kill insects by breaking open little holes in the walls of their guts. And it turns out it pokes those same holes in human cells in laboratories under high concentration. So it might be creating leaky gut. But even if the Bt toxin isn't creating leaky gut in us, the Roundup does, because when you put a little bit of glyphosate in a petri dish of human cells, before you do, there are tight junctions, they're a big barrier. When you put the glyphosate in, boing, they separate with big gaps in them, and that's another form of leaky gut between the cells or with Bt toxin through the cells. And leaky gut is linked to a long list of diseases, inflammation, which is linked to even more diseases, as well as gluten sensitivity, food sensitivity, cancer, obesity, diabetes, not diabetes, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, heart disease. So that's just one area that might explain the long list of diseases that we think are now related to GMOs and Roundup.
Wow. Well, even before like Monsanto jumped in on this, didn't they start like in the early 1970s, like genetically modifying the wheat?
Wheat, it turns out, is not traditionally genetically engineered. It's created through crossbreeding, or they exposed the seeds to radiation causing mutations. So it has been changed, but not through genetic engineering. And GMOs the whole technology was discovered in the 70s. They did have things on the market before the soybeans. They had genetically engineered bovine growth hormone injected into cows to increase milk supply. I was told by a former Monsanto scientist, 3 of his colleagues were testing the cows treated from Monsanto's genetically engineered drug, and they found so much of a cancer-promoting hormone in the milk that the 3 Monsanto scientists stopped drinking milk after that unless it was organic. One bought his own cow. And so we have milk that's extremely dangerous, that's linked to cancer from GMOs. We had another organism that was created by a Japanese company. They used bacteria in fermenting vats to create tryptophan. L-tryptophan is an amino acid. It's used as a supplement. It's a precursor to serotonin. And so you create the precursor and you add some chemicals. And so they decided to add some genes into the bacteria so that you wouldn't have to add these other things afterwards. And so every couple of years, they'd increase it and add another gene. And this was in the 80s. And they were not aware that the process of genetic engineering creates massive collateral damage and unpredicted side effects. And this is almost certainly the reason why their L-tryptophan had a tiny amount of contaminants which killed about 100 Americans and caused 5,000 to 10,000 to fall sick. And the whole thing was, the genetic engineering origins was covered up by the FDA. The FDA was determined to promote GMOs. In fact, they were mandated to promote GMOs by the White House in the early 90s. They therefore brought in Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney, to be in charge of FDA policy. And the policy around GMOs from the FDA still is what he created, and that is that the companies themselves can determine if the foods are safe. They don't have to tell the FDA. They don't have to do any safety studies. There's no labeling requirements from the FDA. And then Michael Taylor, after creating that, went back to worked at Monsanto as their VP. Now, it's interesting that documents made public from a lawsuit show that the foundation, the rationale for that hands-off policy was a lie. The policy said the agency was not aware of any information showing that GMOs were significantly different. And yet the scientists' overwhelming consensus at the FDA was exactly the opposite. that not only was it different, but it was dangerous and needed to be tested carefully, including human toxicological studies. None of that was required. The rest of the world followed it, fell in line behind the FDA. I've been to 45 countries speaking on this, and they say, oh, we don't have to do research because the FDA has done the research, and they say it's true. Well, the FDA doesn't do the research. They leave it to Monsanto. And if you look at the Monsanto research, you can find how they rig their research. So when they feed animals that are genetically engineered, feed them genetically engineered corn, for example, maybe sprayed with Roundup, the control group is fed a standard rat chow made of genetically engineered corn and Roundup. And so it's...
So what's the difference here?
It's not
what are
only,
they testing?
And they're still, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous, Gene. In fact, we have such clear evidence of them rigging their research. When animals die in their studies, they can replace them or say it's not treatment related. When there's clear statistical significance compared to the control group, they'll just hunt the literature for some other control group that may have been poisoned by something and said, see, we can use, quote, historical controls, and as long as it's not statistically significant compared to historical controls, we don't need to do it. And if it's still statistically significant, they say, oh, it's not treatment related, without any biological explanation, and they dismiss it. And they have their people in the FDA and the EPA that follow suit. And they do this with GMOs, and they do this with Roundup. And so I have been cataloging the ways that they use the wrong detection methods, the wrong statistics, the small control size, the short feeding studies, the wrong type of animals, and still they find problems that they have to ignore. I was just treated to a story that I had not heard from before, which was from Monsanto's files made public because of the Roundup lawsuits, which are very famous. They lost 3 lawsuits, and the total jury award was over $2 billion. The judges have brought it down, but the lawsuits revealed, for example, that when Monsanto tested Roundup to see if it was absorbed into human skin, they took cadaver skin, and they found that 10% went through the skin, which is way more, more than 3 times more than is allowed. So they covered that up. They never told the EPA. They took human cadaver skin and they baked it in an oven. Then they froze it, and it became like leather. And then they put the Roundup on, and it didn't go through. And they said, see, hardly any is absorbed into human skin. This is a classic way of how, I mean, we have studies where they or other biotech companies overcooked their samples by 5-fold. In the bovine growth hormone study, they pasteurized the milk 120 times longer, and then they only destroyed with that 19% of the growth hormone in the milk. So they added powdered hormone to the milk at 143 times the natural occurring level, just dumped a bunch of hormone into the milk, pasteurized it 120 times longer, and only under those conditions were they able to destroy 90% of the hormone. And so they published that, and the FDA said, oh, we don't have to worry about genetically engineered bovine growth hormone, because if there's more growth hormone in the milk, it's destroyed, 90% is destroyed during pasteurization, ignoring entirely that it was rigged research under false pretenses with conditions that have never been achieved naturally. And this is the kind of disastrous so-called science that we're seeing.
Well, is there any safety regulations that are going on? I mean, how are GMO foods assessed?
Well, if you have a GMO that you've taken and you've transferred genes to another species, you don't have to tell the FDA. If you do want to participate in the voluntary consultation process, it's technically known as a meaningless exercise. So if you don't send enough information for them to actually evaluate the study. The only one crop was sent with the raw data, and it was the flavor saver tomato. And the scientists said this does not show safety, and they let it on the market anyway. And after that, the biotech industry realizes we don't have to send them the raw data. We'll just send them, our conclusions. And if the FDA scientists ask for more information, they're typically ignored. At the end of this exercise, the FDA writes a letter. And the letter is a joke. It says, for example, this is to confirm that Monsanto believes its corn is safe. And it reaffirms that it is Monsanto's responsibility to make that determination. It does not say that the FDA says that the crop is safe. Now, the EPA if you have a crop that is designed to produce its own insecticide, then that is looked at by the EPA, and you can do just a handful of tests in a few days, and that's all you need. And a lot of their tests are based on the assumption that the toxin produced by genetically engineered corn has no effect on humans or mammals,
Right.
even though there are peer-reviewed published studies that show that it affects and damages the immune system, it can damage tissues, it causes antibody responses in farm workers, and even the FDA's own scientific advisory panel did not agree with the EPA, but they just simply say it's safe because we've been seeing the Bt toxin applied as bacteria and spores for decades, but they ignore the fact that one, those same spores in natural state are causing these problems in animals and humans, and two, inside, and it also washes off and biodegrades when it's sprayed on, but not in the GMO. It's encapsulated and it's produced at thousands of times the concentration. So the entire EPA evaluation is ridiculous. Now the USDA, they may require some field trials to make sure that it's not an invasive problem, but the new gene-edited GMOs, you typically, if you don't transfer the genes in from bacteria or viruses, there's no, quote, invasive species. And so you can send them a note saying, you don't really have to look at this, do you? And the USDA says, no, we don't. And so there's a bunch of gene-edited crops that can go on the market without being looked at by any regulatory agency. And the USDA wanted to formalize this. And so on June 6th, they created a new proposal that's in a comment period where they would basically eliminate any oversight. So they wouldn't be forcing these companies to have to go to the problem of sending in a note. They could just say, you don't need to contact us. And then the Trump administration did an executive order on June 11th, which further erodes across the board all of the so-called approval processes, and then asks for the Secretary of State, the US Trade Representative, and the heads of the USDA, EPA, and FDA to all work together to create a plan to convince the rest of the world to accept US-made new GMOs, the gene-edited ones, and to dismantle the trade barriers, in other words, to stop the required safety assessments anywhere in the world. And now, this is where we get into a new danger, and we haven't even discussed the health dangers of GMOs. Forgive me, because by this time, usually people are going to their cupboards and throwing things out. We'll come to that. But the new dangers are that all these new gene-edited organisms, which are so cheap and easy to create, bacteria, viruses, fungus, algae, trees, insects, all basically anything with DNA is targeted. There could be thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of different versions introduced into the ecosystem where they will corrupt the gene pool forever. So instead of this generation passing on to the next generation the products of the billions of years of evolution, we're going to be passing on designer genes, designer organisms designed for greater profit and control by companies using a technology where the number one most common result is surprise side effects, and it will contaminate the gene pool irreversibly for all future generations. So we have a whole campaign at protectnaturenow.com. There's a 3-minute video which goes into this, and there's some things, some actions people can take. You can sign up to figure, so because we're now figuring out a global response to this existential threat, which, you know, if we solve climate crisis and we protect the oceans and save the soils, we still may lose nature with this problem alone.
Wow. Well, I've seen it myself in the classroom. I'm an educator. I teach chemistry, environmental science, and I've seen it I've been, in the classroom for over 35 years.
Wow.
And back in the day when I first started teaching, I don't teach the same way that I did 35 years ago because they can't handle it.
Uh-huh.
And I've seen such changes. And even just like, okay, I was born in 1960. So in my time, I never saw an autistic child. Never. Until, like, say, the 1990s was when I first saw my first autistic child. Now it's 1 in 68. I mean, and
it's actually, there's unpublished studies numbers that make it even more than that, more frequent. So let me ask you this. What age do you teach now?
High school.
All right. So you're getting kids that are like 15 to 18. And
Right.
so GMOs were introduced 23 years ago. They're increased in the food supply. So they were born into full-fledged GMO diets. The average American eats more than their weight in GMOs, largely from corn and soy. And we have seen, we talked to pediatricians, that soon after GMOs were introduced, there was a raft of new diseases. One pediatrician, Michelle Perro, she's in our film, Secret Ingredients. She said that she finally figured out, she was actually looking at one of my books and went, ding, oh my God, what I'm seeing in these rat photos is what's happening in the guts of our children. She started to prescribe organic diets, and that only under those circumstances were the kids rebounding, because otherwise you're just giving them the medicines and they're not responding because they continue to be toxified, poisoned by GMOs and Roundup. And so same thing with veterinarians, those who were dealing with pets or livestock before GMOs were introduced, a whole raft of new diseases came in. If you look at the epidemiological evidence, more than 30 diseases are rising in parallel with the increased use of GMOs and Roundup. And that includes all sorts of cancers, all sorts of digestive problems, inflammatory issues, autism, anxiety, diabetes, deaths from hypertension, deaths from stroke, deaths from senile dementia and Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. There's peritonitis, hepatitis C, deaths from kidney disease, all these diseases rising in parallel with the increased use of GMOs and Roundup. And I'll go a step further, Gene. When I came out with a film a few years ago called Genetic Roulette. And I was rushing to get it out there because of the Prop 37 labeling campaign in 2012 in California. So I didn't get a chance to get as many testimonials that I wanted. But I started asking people when I was traveling with the film, how many people noticed an improvement in their health when they switched to non-GMO organic foods? And a bunch of people would raise their hand. And I'd say, okay, give me an example. Someone would say, okay, I have a problem with IBS, but it's gone. See how many people noticed a digestive problem? All these hands went up. How many people noticed fatigue getting better? All these hands went up. Brain fog, weight gain, anxiety, depression. We saw 28 different conditions being reported, and it was consistent at 150 lectures. And in more than 24 of these lectures, I'm speaking to medical practitioners at doctors' conferences, chiropractic, nutritionists, and they're speaking on behalf of thousands of their patients and clients. Same thing. So we surveyed 3,256 people and asked them, what did you get better from? And it was the same 28 conditions. And the number one is always, at every lecture and the survey, digestive disorders. 85.2% of the people who filled out the survey got better in digestive disorders, and most of them, dramatic improvements. We had some doctors say, oh yeah, we can predict these things will get better in these many days and these many weeks or these many months when I put them on an organic diet. We talked to veterinarians who put pets on organic food, and they said 80 to 90% of the problems are either solved or basically managed just by changing them back to non-GMO, non-glyphosate sprayed food. And we have this tremendous body of evidence now. And the crowning educational piece is the movie Secret Ingredients. So if you go to secretingredientsmovie.com, you can hear from Kathleen DiChiara, whose family had 21 chronic conditions between the 5 members of the family. Her autistic son was no longer autistic by the end of the film. They had switched to organic food. Another family with an autistic son, no longer autistic. A clinic where they put all these infertile couples on an organic diet. All of them have children now. People with cancer and brain fog and skin problems. And then we have doctors and scientists talking about why GMOs and Roundup may be the culprit here, how they're messing up our microbiome, how they're giving us the inability to absorb minerals. They're creating leaky gut, messing up the energy centers called mitochondria, messing up our ability to produce serotonin, melatonin, dopamine, messing up our hormones, so many things, and causing cancer. So when you look at the science, if you just looked at the science alone, it's like, yeah, I may die anyway. When you look at the people and you realize, oh my God, they got better when they switched to organic diet, that's the motivator.
Well, one of my frequent comments is, we're not living longer, we're dying slower. And we see this. We have one end of the spectrum, we've got people with dementia, Alzheimer's. And on the other end of the spectrum, we've got autism, which is hugely on the rise. And we're in the middle. Who's going to pay for this on both ends of the spectrum?
Well, everyone's paying for it now, but it's going to get worse unless we reverse it. Now, you mentioned Alzheimer's and you mentioned autism. In the film Secret Ingredients, discusses brain inflammation. He says when you take GMOs, it causes the gut bacteria glyphosate, the chief poison in Roundup, is an antibiotic. And it kills the beneficial bacteria more easily than the pathogens. And so it causes a overgrowth in the pathogens, according to research on animals. And now we know that it also happens in humans in a recent human study. So we have a situation now where that can create inflammation along with the leaky gut. And the leaky gut creates a leaky brain or an inflamed brain. So the inflammation here creates inflammation here. And then you end up with things like Alzheimer's and autism and Parkinson's and multiple sclerosis. And in addition to that, you have problems with the serotonin and dopamine and melatonin, which can exacerbate the mental conditions. And on top of that, you have the mitochondrial death or mitochondrial destruction because of the Roundup. And we know more about that since the film. It actually completely destroys the mitochondria in laboratory studies. And the brain uses 25% of the body's energy, a lot of that to run a successful brain. And when you kill or damage the mitochondria, then you end up affecting that as well. So we can connect the dots easily from Roundup to autism and Alzheimer's. And in the surveys, both in 150 lectures and also the formal one, there's a reduction in both Alzheimer's and in autism. And there's an increase in those two, rising in parallel with the increased use of GMOs and Roundup. And I've spoken to a lot of people. I had a 63-year-old come up to me and said, I have autism. And the only reason I'm at your lecture is because I learned from you about changing my diet. And that's how I can come out and be in public. Thank you. He's the oldest autistic person I knew, but I know of parents of young autistic boys that say when they switched to organic food, the kids got better.
Wow. So what are the issues of concern for the environment?
Well, the environment, as we talked about with the corruption of the gene pool, is worse than the health dangers because we end up basically eliminating nature and replacing it with a Monsanto version. Now, there are other specific dangers, and there's damage, for example, from Roundup. Roundup is sprayed on vast amounts of acres, and it kills the beneficial bacteria in the soil. And it promotes soil-borne pathogens. And it also can kill off the milkweed, which is the breeding ground, essentially the food for the young monarch butterflies. They're devastated as a result. It kills off other organisms that are not supposed to be killed off. It compactifies the soil so it doesn't absorb the water. The topsoil gets, along with all the chemicals and the nutrition, which cause algae bloom in the Gulf.
We're seeing a lot of those.
Oh, yeah, it's disaster. I mean, it's absolutely disaster. It creates increased flooding. The Bt toxin damages the marine ecosystems by damaging the caddisfly. It kills non-target beneficial insects. Both the Roundup and the Bt toxin can bind in the soil and remain active or dormant, waiting to pounce in the long run. There's reports of fields being sterile after multiple seasons and plantings in various parts of the country. It's absolutely disastrous. Now, if you look at the genetically engineered bacteria, that has problems that are simply devastating. There was a genetically engineered bacteria that was 2 weeks away from being introduced, but some graduate student got an okay to test it and found out that if they had deployed it like they had planned, it could have rendered vast stretches of land, possibly North America, infertile because the bacteria eats the roots of plants and turns them to alcohol. It was designed to help create alcohol out of plants, and they were going to take the sludge afterwards and spread it as fertilizer. But once you release bacteria, according to an EPA study, it goes everywhere, all over the world, and they change it. They exchange the traits. And so you could literally end up with vast infertile regions from one release of one type of bacterium. And another type of bacterium was already sprayed on the crop. It was called Ice minus. It was designed to prevent strawberries from damage in frost because it did not allow the condensation of water vapor as frost on the strawberries. But from a court order, they had to incinerate it because the people pointed out that there are also weeds that die because of frost. And if you put that out there, the weeds would survive and be a damaging influence throughout agriculture. Well, it turns out that same bacterium, which is a Pseudomonas syringae, it's shaped like little syringes, and the point causes the condensation. By making it blunt and non-condensating, it turns out that that bacterium in the atmosphere is what causes the condensation of water coming into California as the wind comes in from the West Coast. And if that was blunt, genetically engineered bacteria, then we would have altered the weather patterns. You see, it's like this, Gene, this is not rocket science. This is far more complicated. We are babes in the woods, barely understanding what genes do. If they are networks, very few genes operate alone. They operate in families and networks. You increase the activity of one artificially, you make mutations throughout the other ones, you'll create results that no one can predict now, and we don't even have the technology to follow through that network to find out what the answer is going to be. We have corn that's already been in our food that inadvertently has higher levels of putrescine and cadaverine, which are responsible for the foul odor of rotting dead bodies. They're linked to cancer and allergies. We have another corn already in our food supply that has a new allergen called gamazine. So the corn has an allergen in there that's not labeled, and no one knows that it's there, and they might have allergic reactions. We have another allergen which is normally found in soy, but it's up to 7 times higher in Monsanto's GMO soy. No one knows that. So we have a situation where the massive collateral damage as a result of the process of genetic engineering is unpredictable, widespread, and yet now the Trump administration and the governments of Japan, Australia, Chile, Argentina, Brazil want to pave the way for mass introduction of gene-edited GMOs without knowing that this could create a cataclysm.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Well, how precise is genetic engineering?
Well, you can create a gene editing mechanism that will search out a particular sequence on the DNA and cut it. Then it allows the natural cellular repair mechanism to reattach it. None of the reattaching is under our control. So the most precise type of GMO is when you edit a gene and you have a number of things that can go wrong. First of all, it's looking for a particular sequence. You have a target sequence, it may cut there. But there may be 50, 100, hundreds of other parts of the genome that have a similar or same sequence, and you may get cuts there as well. So you end up potentially hundreds or thousands of mutations or deletions or additions. Then when the genome repairs itself, then it can pick up DNA from the environment and bring it in there. And so there was just an article that was reported that there are retroviruses from goats and cows because they used serum from goats and cows as in the petri dishes. And there happened to be some retroviruses there that are integrated into the edited genome. Now, a retrovirus is like HIV. It's a virus that works its way into the DNA and then becomes part of every cell. So now there's animal-based retroviruses being put into this. It's a carefully precise cut and a completely random way of reattaching where it can draw things from the environment. That's how those horns from the cattle got bacteria that happened to be in the petri dish, because that was bacteria that was used for gene editing. So it just took the whole plasmid, put it in there, and now it has the antibiotic-resistant bacterial genes, which bacterial genes can transfer to bacteria very easily under many conditions. So it's not precise in its most precise way, and the typical way to do a GMO is even more bizarre. You take millions of copies of a gene and you put them in a gun and you shoot those guns into a plate of millions of cells, hoping those genes make it into the DNA of some of those cells. Or you use bacteria to infect the cells. You don't know where it ends up in the DNA. It can end up in the middle of a gene or gene network causing changes. And it can cause damage in many other places. So in Roundup Ready Soy, you not only have the one that was intended, but you have other pieces that were randomly entered during the process of, it's called biolistics. And it doesn't produce what it was intended to produce. It produces something that's different, and many replications of it. So it's, in my books, I describe how it is a rigged game against precision. And right now we have not solved the problem, but the requirements of return on investment and patenting have caused companies to ignore it. And their very strong influence in the halls of Congress and the executive branch have given them support from governments.
Wow. So we have foods that have been genetically modified, and they're topped with herbicides like glyphosate. What is this?
Well, it's a recipe for disaster, but it actually gets a little worse, sorry to say, that the Roundup and other glyphosate-based herbicides, not just Roundup, are not just sprayed on the Roundup Ready GMOs. Starting in 2006, Monsanto started promoting the use of Roundup as a desiccant to dry down grains and beans before harvest. So 3 days before harvest, 5 days before harvest, oats, wheat, different grains, beans, sprayed with Roundup, and it gets deeply absorbed into the food portion. And that's some of the highest levels of glyphosate residues, is not the GMOs, but the non-GMO, non-organic grains and beans. It's also sprayed on the rows between grapes and vineyards, so it ends up in wine. It's sprayed on orchards, so it ends up in orange juice. It's basically throughout the food supply. So we want people to eat organic. So I have two prescriptions. One is watch the movie Secret Ingredients at secretingredientsmovie.com. That's the #1 most effective conversion tool we've ever seen. Everyone who leaves there, practically everyone, is like ready to increase their commitment to organic. And then the second is, when you switch to organic, make a diary. Take a look every day at what percentage of foods you have as organic. What is your mood? What is your energy level? What are the 1 to 10 symptoms? And see what happens over a month. It may be that what you're looking at will be the most convincing thing to you and to everyone you talk to after that. And share the results with others. Because right now, I think I've probably heard from more people than anyone in the world, from people who say, I switched to non-GMO, or I switched to organic, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. People tell that to me all the time. Maybe there's a few doctors that hear it more often. I know one doctor that put 9,000 people on an organic diet, and he says, it's incredible. So it's so predictable. It is so dramatic. It is so logical. Because if you just look at Roundup alone, and you see it can damage the foundation of our health, absorption of minerals, gut bacteria, gut wall integrity, mitochondria, neurotransmitters, hormones, the shape of the DNA, whether it becomes mutated or not and becomes cancerous. Even birth defects are affected. So all these are the foundations of our health, and they're all damaged by this one horrible molecule that is everywhere, because Roundup is the single most used agricultural chemical in history.
Well, how does glyphosate work?
Well, it was originally patented as a descaler to clean inside boilers and pipes. So the reason it did that is because it's a chelator. We know the word chelator because in its good wet sense, you can chelate out heavy metals out of the body, because the substance that you put in hugs the minerals and escorts them out. But glyphosate grabs all these minerals, the good stuff, the selenium, the cobalt, the calcium, the magnesium, the manganese, the zinc, and makes it unavailable. So this is how it makes plants weak, because it binds with the minerals and the plants can't perform certain functions. There's all these metabolic pathways, some very complicated, that occur in humans and mammals and plants, and they require the presence of a mineral or two in order to function. If the mineral's not there, everyone is on strike. So when you look at the amount of minerals in these crops that are sprayed with Roundup, they are dramatically lower levels of minerals, and the plant becomes extremely weak and sick. Then the glyphosate also kills the beneficial bacteria, and that bacteria has two jobs. One, it takes minerals from the soil and makes them available in an available format for the plant. So now you have even less minerals. Those bacteria also lower the population of the pathogens, so they're now increasing. But glyphosate also feeds the pathogens directly. It actually expands the fungal populations. So now you have an increased amount of soil-borne pathogens and weaker plants. So it's the soil-borne pathogens that kill the plant. If you spray glyphosate alone on a plant, you won't kill it in sterile soil. But you will kill it in field soil because what's doing the killing are these diseases. So because it is a chelator, many of the antibiotics are chelators to particular minerals. But glyphosate is a chelator to all of the cations, and which means that it kills all sorts of bacteria, but oddly, not the salmonella, E. coli, botulism, not the nasty stuff. And it can cause an overgrowth of things like Clostridium and other things that we really don't want overgrown in our bodies. I talked to one expert, he said basically almost every disease has its basis in dysbiosis or imbalance of gut bacteria.
Oh my gosh. What happens to glyphosate when it enters the body?
Well, a lot of it leaves through urine, and you can test your urine. If you go to responsibletechnology.org, you can click and get a test. But a certain amount gets deposited into different organs. A lot of it make their way to the bones. And according to one radiolabel study with animals, it can last 2 weeks in the body, but if you're continually eating it in the food, so that means it packs up the 2-week supply, it continues to grow, like bioaccumulate, and then you have this level. And, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is very strongly linked to glyphosate. And there was the 3 lawsuits where Monsanto was successfully sued, and they were from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which has its basis in the bone. And that's where a lot of the glyphosate ends. Now, I talked to one doctor, Dietrich Klinghardt, and he said he found a very interesting phenomenon. His sickest patients, including the autistic kids, do not excrete glyphosate in their urine until he starts to detox them. So his theory is that these very, very sick kids have a problem with detoxification and hold on to more glyphosate in their bodies than the rest of us.
Is it water soluble or fat soluble?
It's water soluble.
Okay.
So, it's been found in breast milk. It's been found in liver. It's been found all over the animals' bodies when it's been tested.
Oh my gosh. Well, what are some of the signs and symptoms of exposure to glyphosate?
Glyphosate, the signs are so varied. I think watching the film, you realize, you get a sense of it. In Kathleen Dichiara's family, she was disabled. She had chronic pain, paralysis, allergies, depression, all these different things, just horrible symptoms, couldn't work anymore. Her husband had a breast tumor. Her oldest son was autistic and had all these different diagnoses. Her middle son had constipation and mood swings. Her younger son had head-to-toe eczema. And she put him on a gluten-free diet. They got a bit better. Took out commercial soy, took out commercial dairy, took out dyes. She was studying it. She was studying nutrition and experimenting on the family. And they were quite a bit better, but they were still managing all these categories. When they switched to organic, they all went away. All of the chronic conditions went away.
How long did that take?
Within 3 weeks, the most visible ones went away or started to change, like the skin problems, things that were really overt. Then 3 months, a whole other raft of changes. And then within 6 months, they were basically free of these conditions. And that's after years of suffering. And she points out at the end of the film, plot spoiler, she said, it's amazing that one substance, GMOs and Roundup, can manifest differently in different people, even in the same family. So when you ask for what the signs are, it's more like, if you look at the 28 different conditions that you can, see, if you go to non-GMO improves health, non-GMO improved health, there's a 26-page peer-reviewed article that I wrote about the survey, and just to the left of it is a summary. In that summary, you can see the different conditions that get better. And they're basically all the conditions that we know and love, from autism and fatigue and anxiety and weight, all these different things. So it manifests as poor health. And it depends on the person's weakest link, which is often genetic, or the presence of other toxins, because oddly enough, it doesn't work alone. Glyphosate can dismantle the ability to detox in two ways. It can mess up what's called the P450 cytochrome pathway, which helps the liver detox, and it can reduce the NRF2 pathways, which cause all the cells to detox. So that means all of the other poisons in the body from the environment and from food can be amplified in the presence of glyphosate.
Does it biomagnify in the food chain?
Yeah, it's somewhat for sure, because if it lasts 2 weeks in the body, then if an animal's eating it for 2 weeks, then the full 2 weeks worth has been added to the body's load. That's according to one study. It might last a lot longer. So there is a bioaccumulation. Now, it's interesting that if you read, and I have read, the documents made public from a lawsuit from the scientists at the FDA who were concerned about GMOs, who recommended required testing. They said there's allergies and toxins and diseases and nutritional problems, which is what all the independent scientists point out. One of the documents is from Gerald Guest, the director of veterinary medicine, or the division of, he's the director of the division of veterinary medicine. He said that there are unique dangers and unique risks from milk and meat of animals that are fed GMOs. And part of that unique problem is the possibility of bioaccumulation. When you look at the structure of the milk from animals fed GMOs, it is different. And so I would say that we can't measure the glyphosate in the meat. Some people think it's just hard to tease it apart from the protein. I don't know exactly why, but we do know that the animals suffer, and eating an animal that has been fed GMOs may be much more dangerous for many reasons. I remember talking to a farmer who said that when he was butchering animals, the ones that were fed GMOs smelled terrible. They had discoloration. It looked like they were 15 years old. And the same aged animal that was not eating GMOs, he described a completely different scent. It was not offensive, different color. And his wife told me she would never feed her kids animals that have been fed GMOs because she's seen the difference in the slaughtered animals. And there's so many things that go wrong in the animals that are fed GMOs. And of course, they're mineral deficient, because the GMOs are mineral deficient because not only does the genetic engineering process deprive it of certain minerals, but then you spray it with Roundup and it gets even less. So you have these epidemics now of livestock that are based on mineral deficiency. Even though there's plenty of minerals in the soil in their region, they're just not getting into the food.
Well, do you think that's having an impact, like on, say, osteoporosis, within the body? Because if you're taking the minerals out, I mean, that's our skeleton.
I have never seen anything about osteoporosis. It makes sense because calcium is another one of those minerals that become bound up with glyphosate. But I actually don't know if the amount of glyphosate in the body is sufficient to handle the amount of calcium, which might be in much higher amounts. So the influence on calcium might not be significant. So I don't know. I think it makes logical sense, but I'm going to say simply we need to look more into it.
Okay. Well, in the movie, I was impressed by not impressed, but upset about the infertility and the causes that are happening there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I've talked about the infertility related to GMOs and Roundup for a long time. It's actually also in my earlier film, Genetic Roulette. You have the glyphosate messes up aromatase. Aromatase is the conversion between estrogen and testosterone. So that balance could be off. You have animals, mice that were fed Roundup Ready soy for 8 months. They had damage in their testicles, including damage to the young sperm cells. You have female rats that have been fed GM soy. They had changes in the structure of the uterus, ovaries, and changes in the hormone levels. You have male rats that were fed GMOs. They had changes also. There was one study done by a senior researcher at the Russian Academy of Sciences. She fed female rats GM soy starting 2 weeks before they got pregnant, and continued feeding them, and more than half of their babies died within 3 weeks, compared to less than 10% of the controls whose mothers ate non-GMO soy, and they were also smaller and could not reproduce, those that were fed GMOs. There was another study in Russia of hamsters. By the third generation, most were sterile. There was a study done recently with Dr. Skinner, who was studying epigenetics. He injected Roundup into pregnant rats, and they were okay. Their offspring was okay, but the grandchildren were not, and the great-grandchildren were worse. So it created epigenetic effects that were inheritable, and 90% of the great-grandchildren had serious diseases, including problems with birth. So either the mother or the child died at birth often, and there was also problems with fertility and prostate and kidney issues as well, and obesity. So we have a lot of issues related to reproductive problems, tumors in the testicles. The glyphosate actually enters the placenta, it gets into the cord blood, it gets into the offspring. So we recommend, the pediatricians that I've interviewed recommend that when parents want to conceive, they switch to organic way before trying to have a child, but at least 2 weeks, because it takes 2 weeks for a lot of the poisons to leave the system if you haven't been eating organic.
Wow. And in the movie, once a lot of these people did change, they were able to conceive.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was giving a talk at a chiropractic conference some years ago, and I said from the podium, if anyone has a story they want to share, we will have a video camera, and Amy Hart was there. And so that's how we met Kathleen Dichiara. She was the first person we interviewed. I was like, oh my God, we have the person we need to talk to. And then Marcia Schaefer, a chiropractor, showed up, and she was also in the film, and it's her clinic that she said at the time, but she said, we have 54 infertile couples who've come to us. I put them on the protocol in addition to chiropractic. We deal with mindset, but most importantly, we put them on organic diet, and all 54 are either have kids or are pregnant. And so we went and interviewed him, and then the number rose. And then by the time we released the film, it was up to 92. And I said to her, how many failures? She said, of those that followed the protocol, no failures. And many of these couples had been to fertility clinics, some diagnosed specifically with particular conditions, others no diagnosis, but they had spent a long time trying to have kids, and now 100%. And I spoke to her more recently, and the numbers increased again, and still no fails.
So is there other chemicals that are being used like as pesticides besides what Monsanto is using?
Oh yeah. Pesticides are the broad term for both pesticides and herbicides and fungicides. They're all over the food supply. The synthetic ones are not allowed to be used in organic. So atrazine is a hormone problem. It creates hormone imbalance and changes the sex of amphibians, and it's nasty. There's something called glyphosate, which is sprayed on genetically engineered Liberty Link corn. Was originally put out by Bayer, and they sold it to BASF, and that's linked to birth defects and brain problems. There's a bunch of terrible chemicals, and so the easiest way is not to simply just avoid Roundup, but to switch to organic and make it a lifestyle choice. And it's something that pays off. I mean, people may say that organic is too expensive. I'll give a good argument why not. First of all, I interviewed a family in Omaha, and they were spending, a family of 6, $9,000 a year in medical costs. After switching to organic, no, they were spending 18,000. Then they switching to organic, it went to 9,000. Then it went down below 3,000. So in 1 year, they saved 9,000. Another year, the total savings was over 15,000. And she said, we're spending a lot less than that on food. And I've heard a lot of stories of people saving money by saving on the medical side. So that's one thing. Second, there are ways to buy organic on a budget. And we have programs at secretingredientsmovie.com to help people do that. And then there's also the suggestion that if you combine your food budget with your medical budget and your philanthropy budget, then food is worth the investment. See, when you think about what we want to pass on to future generations, there's a devastation in GMOs and Roundup. In the current GMOs and Roundup, the epigenetic effects of Roundup into the next generations, and also the contamination of the corrupt food supply, the corrupt ecosystem. You know, some people will save their money to the end of the year and make a donation to a nonprofit. Our Institute for Responsible Technology would love it if you'd include us in your Christmas and holiday gifts. Absolutely. That's responsibletechnology.org. I would be remiss if I didn't ask. I fail to ask all the time, and it shows we're suffering. Please give money to Institute for Responsible Technology. However, if you had to choose between a year-end donation and buying organic, buy organic and invest in a healthy food supply. And if you can get local organic, all the better. Farmers markets, CSAs, that's community supported agriculture. You know, you're simply plant-based organization, so you can direct people in that way. People will have their own diets. It's interesting. I'll sometimes be on a panel with the variety, the raw foodists, the plant-based, the paleo, the Western price, and they're all like arguing, and I get to say, and everyone agrees with me to avoid GMOs and eat organic. Everyone, all the experts, unless they're paid by the companies, agree with that.
Well, if you go organic, do they still use a pesticide?
They don't use the synthetic ones. There's some pesticides that are approved, and they're used very sparingly, but the real nasties are the ones that are used in non-organic agriculture.
So how do we know?
There's natural stuff. Well, if it's organic, they may spray some natural stuff. You know, like the natural BT, for example, the BT toxin is found in GMO corn and soy. I don't think it's safe in the way that it's there. But when it's sprayed in bacterial form, which is just occasionally, if there's an overgrowth of certain caterpillars, it then washes off and biodegrades in the sun. But in GMOs, they produce thousands of times the concentration of the spray. It's encapsulated so it doesn't wash off or biodegrade, and it's designed to be more toxic than the spray. So in that case, it's like, I don't want to scare people from using BT toxin in their gardens. Just don't, spray it into your mouth. In the same way, don't eat genetically engineered corn. It may have the BT toxin in every cell.
Wow. Well, you've given us lots of food to think about.
Yeah, food for thought and food to avoid.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, and I see it on a day-to-day basis in the classroom. I do. I see the children can't process the way they did. I don't see them thinking as clear. They have a hard time focusing. They have a hard time processing. And I see, obviously ADD, ADHD, plus a whole host of other things that I see. And I've been looking around, and it's like, what is causing all of this? Because within, just since I've been a child, I've seen all these changes. I mean, I didn't see my first autistic child until the 1990s. And now it's quite common to see them all over the place.
So I'd like to recommend something. We have a program at secretingredientsmovie.com where people buy a license, and then they get to show the film in communities, and they can charge money for it. They can sell DVDs. But mainly we want people to get it out there. I would suggest that try something and maybe have a showing and bring the parents in, and then say, I want to evaluate this with you to see what the results are. Who would like to do an experiment? And we can do it as a group and switch to organic and take notes as a community. And then we will find, if I were to predict it, I don't think every single person will become an evangelical organic eater after that, because some people, the changes will be too subtle. But I think some people will have such remarkable and dramatic impacts, especially if they're sharing the information, the word can get out. There are some chefs who have been able to design and implement organic, healthy food, even at the ridiculously small amount of dollars per meal per student that is declared the national standard. And some others have been able to raise money from community members and even from food companies. But I think that it would be worth it for you and others who work at schools to do a showing and to interest parents and to see if they'd be interested in doing an experiment. Now, there's companies like Azure Standard that will ship food in trucks at a discount for groups to get it, and then it's distributed like a kind of a little co-op. They have 2,500 drop points, or they can ship by UPS. But the group gets together. Maybe you become a drop point for Azure Standard. You receive the food, you distribute it. It becomes a social thing as well. Maybe you have a potluck at the same time, and that way it becomes supported by the community. We actually would like community showings to result in monthly community potlucks of organic food. And then we'll supply additional curriculum if they want to show a little film, if they want to do a little activism in small groups. So we want to create a network where healthy eating becomes socially supportive and it becomes exciting, and then it spreads. And so you can tell I'm an activist first.
Do you give that to educators, the license to show it?
There's a small fee. There's a small fee that help support. I mean, we're still paying off the production costs of the film. There's a lot of, it was a very expensive film. It took 4 years to create. So we don't give it away, but we charge less than almost anyone I know. And you have the license for life, and you get supporting materials, posters, press releases, what to do, things to, and the school can buy an educational license, in which case it can be played throughout the school at any time. It can be part of the library that the teachers check out. We think that this, our goal in making the film was to change the world. Now, you may think that sounds a little preposterous, but I will tell you from experience. When I started working on the GMO issue in 1996, no nonprofit organization was talking about the health dangers beyond 3 or 4 sentences. And I evaluated the situation and felt like that was the wrong strategy. We needed to educate people on the health dangers. So I began interviewing scientists and converting science speak into English. And I wrote Seeds of Deception, and I wrote Genetic Roulette, and I have 4 movies. I gave 1,000 lectures in 45 countries, trained 1,500 people, and helped pioneer the messaging, which resulted in a desire to avoid GMOs that spread. And now 46% of Americans are seeking non-GMO food, and that has started a tipping point of consumer rejection among the food companies in the United States, who are systematically removing GMOs from their ingredients. So I have firsthand experience that we can change the world. And after seeing the impact of films, we decided to create a film and just write another, instead of writing another book.
Well, films are so powerful.
Absolutely.
And it just gets the message across in such a visual way.
Absolutely.
And when you see the stories, and story after story after story,
I know,
you start to go, really? Maybe I should try this. But I think we all have to vote with our dollars. And I think that's one of the biggest things, is we have to say, as a society, this is unacceptable. Unacceptable. And I am not going to buy this anymore. And I think that's just one of the things that we have to do as a society, is to just stand up for this and stand up for our rights. Because I don't think that, the powers that be are they're not supporting us, clearly,
right,
in terms of our health, in terms of what we're doing. So I think we have to vote with the thing that we can vote with, and that's our money. That's our
And it's
dollar.
interesting, unlike a boycott where you have to agree philosophically with something to do it kind of like an altruistic thing, like don't buy this grape, buy this grape. We're doing this to save our lives and to save our kids. So the self-preservation motivation is greater than the social responsibility motivation. So that's why I have never called for a boycott. What I've called for is healthy eating, which creates the voting with the dollar. And so my sign off on my letters is safe eating.
It's true. It's true. When you change and go, it's so profound when you start to see it. And you can, and I've seen like the blood chemistry change in as little as 10 days.
Oh yeah.
You know, without question. I mean, even just from disease people are suffering with, I've seen it change, you know, to the point where they don't need medications anymore for a lot of the issues that they're dealing with. In as low as 10 days. I mean, it's crazy.
I was talking to someone yesterday, and I talked to pet owners as well. I interview veterinarians, and someone had a pet who was having digestive issues that were serious. And she put the pet on organic food, and she said 2 meals, and it changed forever. 2 meals. And that's like ridiculous.
Well, I do that too. I make my own dog's food. And so I know exactly what's going into it. Just like for me, that's the one thing that I can control within my own environment with what I do is I make sure what goes in here is going to be okay for me. And it's not just the food that's going in, because I talk about it being a trifecta, because you have to change what goes in, so food and drink. You have to change what goes on. So this is the personal care products and the toxins we're being exposed to there, you know, and the environmental toxins as well. But then you have to exercise. I mean, so to change your health. I mean,
I'll add one thing though, Gene.
Well, I mean, there's more pieces.
No, but this is my. I mean, in my area,
Mm-hmm.
I have very. I mean, I'm very narrow. But in my area, cotton is sprayed with Roundup, and tampons have glyphosate residues, and bandages have glyphosate residues, and diapers have glyphosate residues, and clothing. So buy organic.
What can we do there? Buy
organic. Yeah, still buy organic. And if you don't have organic clothing, wash it before you wear it. Glyphosate is water soluble, but you're not going to wash the tampons, bandages. We'll wash the diapers. We'll wash the clothing. But, you know, I would stay away from the traditional.
Well, where can you find Band-Aids that are?
But I don't know the answer to that one. But there are natural feminine hygiene products. And I don't own stock in any, but I strongly recommend that once people hear this, they make the change.
Wow. I didn't even think about tampons or Band-Aids.
No one does. No one does.
Wow. That's a big one.
Yeah, no kidding. And the thing is, you have it, you know, open cut with a Band-Aid. Wow. And, you know.
It's going right through.
Yeah,
it's going right in. Wow. Okay. Food for thought, literally.
Food for thought, Gene.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today and to open up our eyes. And I think everybody out here needs to start voting with your dollars and say, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. I'm not buying that. I'm going to buy these organic products. So thank you so much for opening our eyes, for the movie, for your books and everything else that you do. I appreciate your time for today to help us learn.
Thank you so much. And thank you for what you're doing. And safe eating, everyone.